Hello everybody, it's Kenneth from the Archives here with the second in my series of videos looking at Dundee's railway history. Having looked at Dundee's first railway, the Dundee New Tile, in our first video, today we're going to move on to look at the second, the Dundee and Arbroath. A big difference between the two railways is that the Dundee and Arbroath still survives today as an integral part of the Scottish railway network. If you've travelled by train between Dundee and Aberdeen, you will have travelled on the line, which has many picturesque scenes as it passes along by the water. I love this Alec Cooper picture of a train coming along from Broughty Ferry up to Dundee past the side of the Tay in the days of steam. This picture is also important because this is actually roughly where the site of the railway's original terminus was, as we'll mention later in the video. But let's get on to how it all started. In the 1830s, the roads between Dundee and Arbroath weren't good, and most goods that moved between these two towns did so by water. Now, obviously, building a railway would be a quicker way to facilitate that process, and it also would connect with many important smaller settlements on the way, and indeed would help Dundee and Arbroath to expand. And so, in 1834, George Mathewson was commissioned to do a survey of a line between the two towns. And this plan in 1835 shows the route that he proposed. This is part of a larger plan and shows the route between Dundee through Broughty Ferry towards Moneyfeith as the railway proceeded on its way to Arbroath. An Act of Parliament authorising construction of the line was granted in 1836, and by 1838 it was ready to open. Although, as I've said, at this point it only connected between Arbroath and the terminus, which, if you know the road bridge that Broughty Ferry Road crosses when it joins Dundee Road, just beyond Broughty Ferry, that was where the terminus was. It was often referred to as Craigie Terminus. It was only ever intended to be a temporary terminus, though the railway was planned to come into Dundee, and in 1839 it came further into the town, reaching Rudyard's, which is marked by a red square on this map I've included at the top here, and the following year, 1840, it came all the way in, reaching the terminus that was intended at Trades Lane. You can actually see from the plan at the bottom, Charles Edwards' 1846 plan of Dundee, that to get into the city proper, it was built on a causeway over the Tay. This meant that the shoreline was pushed further south, and you can see as late as 1846 there were still pools of water on the north side that would later be filled by buildings, mostly of an industrial nature. It also allowed the development of the docks to the south of the railway. Now, I should mention at this point one of the eccentricities of the railway was that it wasn't built to a standard gauge. It wasn't quite built to the gauge we know today, nor was it built to the broad gauge as employed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel on the Great Western, but somewhere in between. And this was a problem, as it would have greatly restricted its future connections with other railways, and eventually led to it being re-gauged to today's standard gauge in 1846. Another little anomaly was in coming into the town, it was crossing land that was owned by the harbour trustees, who were quite worried about the potential impact of a railway. And so, although it was built by the Dundee and Arbroath, the last section between the original part of the line and into the station would be operated as an independent railway, technically owned by the harbour trustees until 1907. Now, the original terminus at Trades Lane wasn't terribly big, and it was fairly quickly clear it wasn't going to be a lot of use for a railway that had big ambitions. And so eventually it was decided a better terminus was needed. Here we see the Act of Parliament 1851 authorising a new terminus in Dundee, but it wasn't until later in the decade, in 1857, that the new station opened, roughly where the Trades Lane station was, but slightly further in and further to the north. And that would become known as Dundee East Station. And you can see the East Station in this picture of Dock Street in the 1890s. It's the building with the semicircular roof in the background. It was never a particularly imposing station. Of Dundee's three major stations, it was probably the least ostentatious and the most Spartan. It did later get a vaguely Art Deco facade constructed, but it was never a huge station. However, you can see from the map it did have substantial goods yards round about it, and you can see that even better in this plan from 1870, where we can see the station, we can see the goods depot sheds in front of it, and we can see the substantial mineral depot at the other side. And by this point, it was becoming a fairly big railway. One of the key features it had related to Broughty Ferry. Now, as I've mentioned, it helped Broughty Ferry build up in size. It meant it was easy for Broughty Ferry to become a suburb of Dundee. But there are other things about Broughty Ferry that are interesting because of two additions which joined the railway at Broughty Ferry. The first of these was the branch to Broughty Pier in 1847. Now, originally, this formed a triangular junction with the pier line connecting up what is now St Vincent Street to join the main line to connect towards Dundee and connecting towards Arbroath, as you can see on the map. However, the Dundee line didn't last terribly long, and eventually the trains using the pier branch that wanted to go to Dundee had to be reversed. Now, why was the Broughty Pier line important? Well, because it formed a part of a direct route between the north of Scotland and Edinburgh. Basically, what was known as the floating railway, a railway ferry, took carriages and wagons across the Tay from Broughty Pier to the harbour at Tayport, where it joined what was eventually became the North British's line at Tayport. Trains could then go across Fife to the Forth, where again they would cross the Forth to Granton and connect up with Edinburgh. Obviously, this was eventually superseded because it wasn't a terribly quick or efficient system, and they wanted a bridge, so it was superseded by the Tay Bridge. Now, of course, the Tay Bridge was first opened in 1877, but collapsed disastrously in 1879. So in 1880, this line reverted to being the main route to Edinburgh until the second and current Tay Bridge was completed in 1887. This map also shows another major line connected to Dundee that spun off from the Dundee and Arbroath, the Dundee and Forfar Direct Railway. Now, the Dundee and Arbroath did allow access to Forfar already by going to Arbroath and then taking the Arbroath to Forfar route, but a quicker route between Dundee and Forfar was wanted, and was in 1870s we got one, the Dundee and Forfar Direct. Just beyond Broughty Ferry Station and the junction with the pier, it branched off to the south and then crossed the railway, going up through Barnhill via Maniki to Forfar. And this allowed Barnhill to develop as a commuter area as well, with its own station. The Dundee and Forfar wasn't as big a success as the Dundee and Arbroath, and eventually would close to passenger traffic in the 1950s. Broughty Ferry Station is one of the most important stations on the line, and this is how many of you will be familiar with it. It's changed its appearance several times over the years, but these pictures from the 1990s from the Dixon Park collection show the station as it arguably was most famous, with the gates on Grey Street, the famous crossing bridge, and the tall signal box. Now, this has all been redeveloped within the last few decades, so it doesn't look like this anymore. But the reason the station itself is important is because this was the site of a station when the railway opened in 1838, and it's thought to be the site with the longest continuously operating railway station in Scotland. Yes, there has been a station on this site for over 180 years. If you think about it, that's quite remarkable. Here's another of the line's stations at Carnoustie, an image taken just before the First World War. Now, Carnoustie was important because there were people who lived in Carnoustie and worked in either Dundee and Arbroath, so it had commuter traffic, but it and Arbroath itself also became popular tourist destinations as a result of the railway. As I've said, most of the railway survives. What doesn't survive is the East Station. It was really surplus to requirements by the 1950s and closed in 1959. We've got quite a lot of records relating to the railway in the archive here, just some which you can find on the catalogue. It includes plans, minutes, photographs, and various other odds and ends. And if you're interested in them, please let us know. Hope you enjoyed that video. In the meantime, stay safe, take care, and we'll be back with another video soon.